basically she's just trying to get herself educated on what these tests are, how they're used. And the STC sent her to me, interestingly enough, and so I become her expert.
This is Bob Burke.
Hey, Bob.
Hi. Dan, our subject. And I'll call. I just sent Ginger a text.
Thank you.
Dan, I'm an old newspaper reporter, so just try to put up with all this silly TV news stuff.
No, you're okay. You're fine.
So, well, tell me this, Dan. Who is it that's overseeing this to make sure that these fields are being constructed and put together properly?
Well, I think the major issue that the industry is facing is that there is no governing body that is overseeing kind of the long-term performance or setting any kind of standards. Right now, the standards are in place, and they're voluntary standards from ASTM. But it's not like the NCAA or the NFL has standards that they implement or enforce. It's very unlike Europe, where all the sports governing bodies have standards and do enforce them. And in this country, we just don't have that enforcement.
And why is that enforcement not there?
Well, primarily just because I think the industry has relied on ASTM to implement standards and keep those standards updated so that the NFL and the NCAA does not have to take the responsibility of enforcement. The problem is basically that ASTM is a commercially dominated organization, so it's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, in that they're not motivated to set higher performance and safety standards.
Okay. Now, and I apologize for my somewhat ignorance on this subject, but I didn't know I was doing this interview 5 minutes ago. What did you say, ASTM?
Yeah, ASTM is American Society for Testing and Materials, and they are a voluntary standards organization. ASTM controls standards from the strength of a steel I-beam all the way down to playground safety and artificial turf playing surfaces.
Okay, but that is not a governmental entity, is that right?
No, it's not. It's a volunteer organization.
So what needs to be done to put together some sort of body that would have oversight, would set standards that might make things safer?
Well, I think that the trend is now, if you take a step back and you ask athletes what surfaces they would rather play on, every one of them would tell you they would rather play on a very great natural grass field versus a synthetic turf field. Up until a couple of years ago, we really didn't know how those natural grass fields performed using the test apparatus that we use for synthetic turf. And now we do, and we see how different these surfaces really are. So what it's going to take are more scientists and non-interested parties, I would say, on the medical professional side, neurologists like Dr. Robert Cantu, universities that are doing this kind of research. But then ultimately, if it's going to be enforceable, it would have to be a standard, I think, from some of the sports governing bodies, whether that could be U.S. Soccer, setting soccer standards, it could be the NFL, it could be the NCAA, just like it's done in Europe.
And is natural grass or natural turf, is that safer than synthetic turf?
In general terms, yes. If you look at the way we measure these surfaces, there are units called GMAX. There's a head injury test method, and then there's a stiffness test method as far as how you're running on it. Because what you don't want to do is make fields really soft to protect against head injuries, but then they're too soft to run on, and then you cause ACL tears and things like that. So we really need to have these values established, and natural turf will always outperform on a pretty significant level the safety values that you get when you compare it to synthetic turf.
So why aren't all fields just staying natural turf instead of moving to synthetic turf?
The reason is hours of play. You really can't play very much on natural grass without killing it. And, in Texas, I'm sure you're aware that if you have a big rainstorm and then you play a football game, the field is a mud pit at the end of that game. So the reason synthetic turf is so prolific and will continue to be so is because you can do everything on it, hours and hours a day. It reduces your maintenance by a lot. And it's always green, and you don't have to water it, you don't have to mow it, so it's easier on the maintenance guys for schools.
So in absence of any sort of governing body that sets the standards, what should be done in the meantime before that might be put together?
Well, I think we're in a period of education. One of the things we do at our company is focus a lot on education. We fund a lot of university research, including the studies that have benchmarked really great natural grass, so that we know what the surface ideal is. And so I think as the marketplace gets more educated, as they see their old fields age and get harder and test and maybe fail some of these tests, there's more of a trend to try and achieve greater safety values, but we're still just scratching the surface.
And is there anything that people can do to push forward or advance something that's more similar to what is done in other countries as far as setting standards for this?
Well, the NCAA and the NFL, or in particular the NFL and the NFL Players Association, right now are engaged in research, looking at all these things and trying to include some new test methods about how we look at these fields. I think that when they really reach the science, then the challenge is going to be ultimately for them, they're going to run into the commercial side of this industry, which doesn't want change. But change needs to happen. So I think it's going to be a big challenge. I think the sports governing bodies in this country are not used to having standards, whereas in Europe, FIFA and the FIH for field hockey and World Rugby all came into this with the understanding that they would be the enforcement arm for standards.
And does the industry not want standards because it's more expensive? Is it what would be their pushback in that?
Primarily, it's economically driven, yes. The ability to achieve a synthetic turf surface as safe and as high performance as a perfect natural grass surface exists today, but it is not a cheaper solution. It is an investment that schools make in the future of their program. But as turf has become kind of commoditized over the last 5 or 6 years, it's all about squeezing pennies from the stone. And spending that extra money on safety is a challenge.
Okay. Dan, tell me again, your last name is what? Did you say Sawyer?
Sawyer, like Tom Sawyer.
Okay. All right. Dan, I appreciate it. I think I've run out of questions on a subject I know nothing about. But I appreciate your input, and you drove in from...
I'm close. I'm close. Don't worry. And you know what, Jack? If you guys have other questions or you want to continue this, just give me a call. I can come down anytime. It's not a problem.
And thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Is there anything that you try to get out? Anything that, your message that you try to communicate to people as you're a leader in this industry?
Yeah, I think that the issue up until now has been the United States is the only country in the world that used one test called the GMAX test to tell you whether a surface was safe or unsafe. If you go to Europe, there's about 12 different performance and safety tests that they use to determine whether a field is safe or unsafe. And understand that standards that were developed in Europe were all based on a perfect natural grass field. So the FIFA performance standard, for example, they had athletes run around on perfect natural grass fields, and they measured the forces on those athletes. And those became the values that FIFA would allow you then to build a synthetic turf field for professional play as long as it met the same values as perfect natural grass. We're trying to adopt those standards over here, but we're meeting with a lot of resistance because the commercial interests don't want to see that change. They're harder standards to pass. It does drive the cost up of the field a little bit. It doesn't double the cost of the field, but it does drive it up a little.
I think that would be hard for, say like a high school to put in a field. Like, how are they going to run around testing how their field is maintained or, aging? Like, they don't have that kind of budget or that kind of thought process.
And you hit on a very important point. The big issue in the synthetic turf industry is the lack of maintenance that goes on these fields. So they build them on day one and they feel really great, but because they're always green and they always look great, they never maintain them. Budgets are cut from schools. They're struggling, as we know, and so the last thing they're going to spend their money on is maintaining a plastic grass field. The problem with that is that these fields do get hard over time. If you run on something over and over and over, it compacts, the fields get stiffer and harder, and the Gmax goes up. And you want lower Gmax. Lower Gmax is better for head injuries and all kinds of other reasons. So the lack of maintenance is a big problem. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing all these, kind of aging and degrading fields. If you do maintenance, you can keep them in better shape, but you still can't maintain what a perfect natural grass field does.
What's the lifespan to put a field in when's it
A typical lifespan of a synthetic turf field is 8 to 10 years. Now, it also depends on how you define what's the life of a field. We would consider the life of a field to end when the Gmax exceeds that of a great natural grass field, which typically happens in year 2 or 3. So if you define how long does a field last by what it looks like, it's one thing. If it's how long does it last based on a safety criteria, it depends on where you set your threshold.
Is there any kind of education process that goes into effect? I'm a high school, I put in a field, I'm proud of, I raised all this money from bonds, levies, what have you, and then how do I know as a athletic director or the school principal that my field is no longer safe?
There's supposed to be annual testing done on them, and that's typically when you see how the designer writes the specification. They put in, you have to test the field on day one and every year thereafter. So you are supposed to monitor them. The issue, as you stated, is budgets, and that it's you always test it on day one because that's how you kind of certify your field. But then over time, you forget about it. It's about $1,000 to test your field, and schools just don't want to spend $1,000 every year to monitor how that field is performing.
So I don't know if you have kids, but if you did have kids, would you let them play on these fields?
Only if I tested it first. We actually we have 3 sets of this equipment that is we test fields for free because we like to collect data and we want to know how this industry is performing over time. So we have compiled a huge database of what fields do and look like over time, and it's not really a pretty picture. So there's certainly room for a lot of improvement.
And the kind of injuries that are being seen, talk about those a little bit.
Well, the injuries we're talking about are head injuries. I mean, the thing that we're chasing is reducing the likelihood and severity of concussions. So if you look at the concussion problem in this country, and it has been called the national epidemic, there are a lot of factors. What your helmet you're wearing, your age, your skill level, your neck strength, your body weight, all kinds of things. The surface is the one piece of equipment that everybody plays on and everybody hits it all the time. So that's why now the playing surface itself is reached kind of a national level of what are we doing about making the surfaces that they play on safer.
Interesting. You've been around a lot of football fields. Have you
No, I
thought
thought this was going to be about the little black ball.
Yeah, which is the stuff we've done, the chrome rubber and all of that, but it's the
And how,
line.
so if you properly maintain a field, you said the lifespan is 8 years. Is that, if you properly maintain it, how quickly does it degrade if you just, like most schools probably, just throw the thing out there?
Well, it's important to understand what thresholds are there. The ASTM threshold is 200 Gs, so 200 times the force of gravity. At 200 Gs, your skull will fracture. So you really don't want to be anywhere near 200 Gs, and yet that's where the ASTM standard is set. The Synthetic Turf Council, which is an industry association, has said, well, let's lower that to 165 Gs, give ourselves a little safety factor. And they reached 165 through no scientific method. That's what they could get the manufacturers to agree upon. If you look at natural grass, you're at 80 Gs, maybe 90 Gs. So about half of what you would experience on synthetic turf. So in other words, when I fall down and my head hits the turf, I'm a soccer player, I'm not wearing a helmet, the energy that my head would experience on a synthetic turf field at the limit of the Synthetic Turf Council would be double that of a natural grass field. So not good. But and so the threshold that we like to see is if you benchmark natural grass, the most you would ever see on a natural grass field is about 115 Gs. So to us, that should be the limit, because all athletes prefer natural grass for synthetic turf. So that's what we should be providing for them. Synthetic turf is sold as good as great natural grass, and yet if you really measure it, it's really not. It can be, but it's not as it is today, the way we're building them, mostly today.
Mostly due to economics.
Primarily due to economics and education. As athletic fields have proliferated in the United States, most of them are only about 10 years old now. So we're at the end of the first life cycle. So we're kind of at a point where we're seeing, okay, this is what we thought would happen and this is what really happened. Where do we go from here? So what we're hoping is that the next 10 years addresses the issues of the first decade of synthetic turf in the industry.
And you said this really isn't a cheaper solution for the schools, is it? Because that's why I thought they were all doing them, was that, throw it out there and we don't have to think about it anymore.
Well, it is cheaper theoretically to maintain a natural grass field than it is to put in a synthetic turf field. But so there's a big capital upfront cost for synthetic turf. But once you spend that money, then you ride it out for 8 or 10 years. So it's a different budget as well. So the maintenance of a field is an operations budget. A synthetic turf field is a capital budget. So it comes out of a different line item. So when we pass bonds for capital improvements, you get that money to use it for synthetic turf. You don't get that money to maintain a natural grass field. You had asked, when does a field end its life? Historically, the most dominant manufacturer, you'll start out at about 120 Gs on their field, and within a couple of years you'd be in the 140, and they actually tell you you want to have 165 Gs on your field. So there are also commercial interests out there that are promoting higher Gmax because that's what they sell.
All right, I think we're good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.